Paper rambling, take two. Okay, maybe this is what I should always do when I make videos here, is to make sure that half of it is out of focus, so I have to redo it. So I can be briefer the second time around. Anyway, what I wanted to do is explain to you again how paper can be so different, and you really don't know until you try it out. There was a paper that was created by Cranes for the letterpress circuit. And letterpress is a type of printing process where a plate is made, a metal plate, or now a plastic plate of some sort, is made with the image that you want printed, and you ink that up and you smush it into the paper. And what you get is something like this. This is the design I did for a save the date for a wedding, and it was letterpressed. And as you can see, I will make sure it's in focus, the ink color area, the area that the ink was applied to the paper, is pushed into the surface of the paper. So it has a three-dimensional quality. And this particular paper, Lettra, get it in focus again, this paper has sort of a nice soft felt-like quality to it that took the ink, as well as, more importantly, from Lettra's manufacturing point of view, allowed for a impression to be visible. It was very soft, and you could see that even if the plate just gently kissed the paper, it would still have that bump that you like. Engraving, on the other hand, has the same sort of dimensional quality, but instead the part that's inked is pushed out, comes toward you from the surface of the paper, because in this case the plate that's made, the part that's inked is a negative part of the, where's my thing? This, let's pretend this is our plate. In letterpress, the part that's inked comes up and pushes into the paper. With engraving, the part that contains the ink is pushed into the plate so that the paper is smushed down into the metal plate, and the ink is transferred to the paper. But also, so too is the bump, the groove, which then is a positive. Engraving sticks out, letterpress sticks in. So that's where that story goes. The paper that Cranes made for this, they made matching envelopes, which of course makes sense because you want to engrave or letterpress your return address on the back flap. And but the paper that they used to use, now they've improved it a little bit. The paper that they used to use worked horribly with my pens and my ink. And I called Cranes up on the phone and complained, and they said, well, you're not supposed to write on our envelopes. Well, what do you mean? You're supposed to use them for letterpress. And I said, I'm supposed to have a plate made for each one of my guests and have a letterpress person make one envelope at a time? And he said yes. And I said, well, that's not going to happen. No one's going to want to do that. Actually, I did have one customer do that. And $10,000 later, he told me how stupid it was to do that. They've improved the paper. Before, this would have had all sorts of skipping areas in it, and it doesn't have them now, so I'm glad they fixed it. But I just wanted to point out that, you know, papers are all very different. I bought these 2 pieces of paper from my neighbor who sold me these envelopes. And I'm tossing them aside. I don't mean to do that. He is a letterpress person, and he was having a sale of paper that he didn't need anymore, and I bought some from him, including these 2 pieces of paper. And I didn't just buy 2 pieces, I bought that many pieces. And when I tried this one out, when I got back home and tried it out, I was saddened to see that it bleeds. And if I were to use this paper to do a very refined crosshatchy drawing of a house or something, it would be very bleedy and inexact and awful. Wherever I stop and think, the line gets bigger because the ink is being sucked into the paper. So I tried this piece of paper. This is the same company that made this paper. It's a slightly different color. And this paper does not have that problem. So whatever recipe they used here is not the recipe they used there. And this will be fine for doing drawing with pen and ink. This is not going to be fine for pen and ink. So I don't have to. I can, sometimes I'll try a piece of paper and it'll do something that's entirely unexpected. And I'll say, oh my God, this is great. I immediately know what I want to do with this paper. I'm not having that feel here. Sometimes, you see people drawing on, and there's a guy that does great drawings on napkins, which are very bleedy, very absorbent. And I don't know how he does it with a fountain pen, but he does it, and he does beautiful drawings on paper napkins. And I don't know what ink he uses, but it doesn't absorb fast. Maybe he draws really, really fast. You don't see that problem. But if you hesitate or draw slow, then it's going to suck into the fibers of the paper. So, yes, maybe in a day or two, I'll figure out what I can use this paper for, because now it's percolating in the back of my brain that maybe this effect that I'm getting with this pen is going to be of value to me, and I'll have a use for the 150 sheets of this stuff that I just bought. I hope. I paid $10 for the pack, so it's fine. But it's just it's amazing that, in addition to pen and ink and nib and hand, that paper also is an important factor in what you do with your pen, and or how you do it with your pen. So this paper, it's very thick paper, which is interesting. Normally I don't use paper that's this thick, but it's nice. It's a nice feeling. One of the things too, when I have to do a calligraph a long poem, I'll take a little corner of the paper or a different sheet of it, and I'll draw with pencil, and I'll see if it erases. Sometimes pencil erases really well, goes away completely. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you erase it and the paper pills. you get little chunks of paper coming up along with it. So I always test that out before I start any large project. These are little factoids that little list I go through. It's like a pilot for a 747, check this, do that. Is this on? Is that off? And, there have been times when I have done a pencil drawing and I get out my ink and I draw it all in ink, and then I start erasing it after hours of labor, and the paper just disintegrates underneath the eraser. And I'm not using a complicated tool. It's a art gum. It's not even a hard rubber eraser. This is like the softest kind you can get. And it should erase. So test your tools before writing that poem. If you're writing a limerick, that's one thing. If you're writing the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, that's something entirely different. How does the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner start? Come on, Pierre. You know this. The wedding guest could still. Guest remit the eyes, feast was set. Makes tear the married. There once was an ancient mariner who stoppeth one of three by thy long grey beard and glistening eye. Wherefore stopp'st thou me? The bridegroom's doors are open wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set. Mates tear the merry din. There was a ship, quoth he. No, anyway, but that's, if the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner was this long, I've recited only the tiniest part of the first stanza. So the last thing you want to do is to write the whole thing out, get all the way down to the end, erase the lines, and tear your paper while doing it. So plan ahead. In my earlier version, my earlier out of focus version, I told a story of an inner envelope, which I didn't come up in the conversation. So I'll tell it to you now. When you get a envelope in the mail, if you go to a fancy wedding, and the wedding people getting married are paying a lot of money, you'll get an engraved invitation, and you'll get an outer envelope, and it'll say Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, 27 Western Avenue, Boston, Mass. 02143, and you'll open it up, and you'll take out an inner envelope, which is almost as big. Pretend this is almost as big, and this will say Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Here it had your Mr. and Mrs. John Smith and your address. This just says Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And that came from a time when you had a servant that would open your mail for you. The dirty mail that came through the street, covered in horse shit and smog and everything else that happened in New York City in 1900. And he would dispose of that, and then on the silver platter would be this that said Mr. and Mrs. Smith, because you were the only Mr. and Mrs. Smith in the house. You didn't need to have John put there. So some people still do the outer and inner envelopes for weddings. And the inner envelope is always, you're supposed to do Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Sometimes you can say the Smith family, or you'd say Mr. and Mrs. Smith and Jacqueline for the child that's living at home who's under 18. You would do that if she was invited. But sometimes, these days, though, Amy Vanderbilt would be spinning in her grave. You don't know who Mr. Smith is going to bring to your wedding, and normally you would find that out. But we're lazy these days, so you'd say Mr. Smith and guest. Mr. Smith and guest. I can hear Amy Vanderbilt saying, the people you invite to your wedding are people you know, or at least know the name of. You do never invite a stranger to your wedding. Well, those days are gone. Now you can invite anyone to your wedding. So anyway, one of my clients said, all of our guests love your invitations. They love the calligraphy on the envelope, blah, 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 blah. And our friend, Mr. John Smith, he framed the inner envelope and put it above his bed. Mr. Smith and guest. So that's in a frame above his bed. And I like that. I like that Mr. Smith has a fun life. Certainly more fun than mine. And that he doesn't need to know the name of everyone that he knows intimately. I like that idea. If you'd like me to make a beautiful calligraphed thing with your name, Mr. Jones and guest, let me know. I'd be happy to send you one, and you can frame it and impress all of your guests with your thoughtfulness. Bye.